Russian President Vladimir Putin and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are old friends, and until quite recently have always been steadfast allies. Israel and Russia face a similar series of common threats, which they cite as reasons for their current wars. So why isn't Russia coming to Israel's aid? We'll unpack that in this video. Russia and Israel are both surrounded by enemies on their borders, enemies committed to their destruction. Russia and Israel are both fighting the existential threat of terrorism. Russia and Israel are both going it alone, facing scorn and even shame from the United Nations. Russia and Israel are both engaged in combat against an ideology of fascism that persists from the World War II era, when both the Ukrainian nationalists and the Arab nationalists were both Nazi collaborators. Israel and Russia declare their military goals as, quote, demilitarization and denazification of the enemy. You've heard a lot about the Nazis in Ukraine, but how much do you know about the Nazis in Palestine and Arabia? Check out my video, The Nazi Roots of Hamas. A link is in the description for more information on that. The special relationship between Russia and Israel dates back to 1948, when the Soviet Union was the primary driver behind the UN's creation of Israel. Prior to that, Joseph Stalin made numerous attempts to establish a Jewish homeland in the USSR. And for more info on that, please see my video, Before Israel, There Was a Soviet Palestine, a Jewish homeland in Russia. That's from episode 19 of Strange Bedfellows, and I'll put a link in the description for that one as well. You see, without the Soviet Union's help at the United Nations, the State of Israel would not exist today, and it would not have been created at all. It was also the Soviets, not the Americans, who provided military support to Israel during the 1948 war against their Arab neighbors, ensuring Israel's survival as a newborn nation. During the Cold War, the Soviet-Israeli alliance fell apart as the Americans forged stronger ties with Israel. The Soviets began to ally themselves with their former Arab enemies, a fatal error that contributed to the Soviet war of attrition in Afghanistan and eventually the fall of the USSR. The relationship between Israel and Russia has improved significantly since the early 2000s with the end of the Cold War and the election of the more pro-Israel Russian leader Vladimir Putin and the election of the more pro-Russia Israeli leader Ariel Sharon and his successor Benjamin Netanyahu. In March of 2016, Putin said the relations with Israel were special and based on, quote, friendship, mutual understanding, and the long common history. He said Russia and Israel have developed a special relationship. 1.5 million Israeli citizens come from the former Soviet Union. They speak the Russian language and are the bearers of Russian culture, Russian mentality. They maintain relations with their relatives and friends in Russia, and this makes the interstate relations very special. The Russian language is the third most widely spoken first language in Israel after Hebrew and Aramaic. Israel has the third largest number of Russian speakers outside the post-Soviet states and the highest as a proportion of the total population. Over 100,000 Israeli citizens live in Russia, with 80,000 of them living in Moscow, while hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens currently live in Israel. Israel's huge Russian population celebrates the World War II victory against the Nazis, Victory Day, on May 9th every year. Russia recognizes West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel as of April 2017. Putin and Netanyahu declared themselves to be, quote, unconditional allies in the war on terrorism. So where is Russia now in Israel's time of need? following the largest terror attack in Israel's entire history. Is their long, strong alliance in danger? And if so, why? The answer, as it was during the First Cold War, is that the United States is driving a wedge between Russia and Israel. That wedge is Ukraine. In December of 2018, Israel reversed its stance on Crimea at the United Nations, voting to condemn Russian activity there. Israeli officials stated they did so at the request of the United States government. However, the following year, in August 2019, Netanyahu declined to condemn the annexation of Crimea, stating that he had nothing to add to what was done at the time of the annexation. And then, following the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, Israel-Russia relations took an even worse downturn and then improved somewhat after Netanyahu's return as prime minister, although much chillier than they were before the Russo-Ukraine war began. Unlike many Western countries, Israel has maintained relations with the Kremlin, refused to impose sanctions against Russia, and rejected calls to send defensive weaponry to Ukraine. Israel resisted incredible pressure from Western allies and NATO to turn against Russia. Israel declined to co-sponsor a UN Security Council resolution condemning the Russian invasion, leading to an expression of disappointment by the United States. Israel later voted in favor of a UN General Assembly resolution condemning the invasion, at the request of the United States. Also at the request of the U.S., Israel pushed the United Arab Emirates to back that resolution. Russia then subsequently expressed their strong dissatisfaction to the Israeli foreign minister over Israel's support of the UN General Assembly's resolution. Back in 2014, Israel took a neutral stance on the Russian annexation of Crimea at the United Nations, which angered the U.S. State Department and the White House under President Barack Obama. That same year, Israel launched Operation Protective Edge in Gaza, which Russia endorsed. During Operation Protective Edge in 2014, Putin stated that, quote, "I support Israel's battle that is intended to keep her citizens protected." Yet, Putin did not defend Israel after the October 7th invasion by Hamas. It took Putin 10 days to call Prime Minister Netanyahu to offer his condolences in the aftermath of the 10/7 attack. Russia's foreign ministry instead pressured Israel to agree to a ceasefire and allow goods to come into Gaza, while at the same time signaling support for Palestinians and meeting with Hamas leadership privately. The United States and Russia don't agree on much of anything anymore, yet we have recently heard them echoing one another when accusing Israel of indiscriminate bombing of civilians in Gaza and decrying the mounting Palestinian casualties. For many in the West, not least in Israel itself, the Hamas delegation's visit to Moscow was a pointed thumb in the eye of the relatives of the victims, most of them civilians, and of a reeling government. What happened to that special relationship, Israelis wondered. Ironically, both Russian President Putin and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu are accused of genocide and war crimes for how they have conducted their wars in Ukraine and Palestine. Both leaders are criticized by the international community and may yet face charges at the International Criminal Court. Russia's ties with Israel are changing rapidly in a dramatic fashion as a direct result of October 7th. Quote, "Israel has a complicated relationship with Russia. That's not a secret and it's not new," said a spokesman for the office of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu last month. In his 2022 memoir, Netanyahu praised Putin and thanked him for his policies in support of the Jews. But those relations have been vexed by Moscow's growing ties with Iran, which has vowed to destroy Israel, and Syria, which is known to harbor groups that are hostile to Israel. Russia has played a key role in helping Iran develop its nuclear capabilities, a lucrative source of revenue for Iran. Both Moscow and Tehran say the efforts have been geared solely at peaceful uses of nuclear power, electricity generation, though that hasn't reassured Israel. According to an official statement, Russia maintains, quote, an unchanged position in support of a just solution to the Palestinian problem. Moscow has declined to designate Hamas a terrorist group. Israel condemned Moscow for hosting the Hamas delegation and for a separate visit from an Iranian deputy foreign minister. The rapprochement with Hamas is consistent with a historical pattern from the late 20th century. During the Cold War, Moscow armed and otherwise supported Palestinian terrorist militias, continuing to do so even at the height of détente. It proved a fatal mistake for the USSR. Russia now stands at the same crossroads again as it did in the Cold War, pressured to turn her back on Israel, a longtime ally she shares a unique relationship and kinship with, at a fateful hour in Israel's history, and indeed Russia's history as well. In 2011, Vladimir Putin said, quote, Israel is, in fact, a special state to us. It is practically a Russian-speaking country. Israel is one of the few foreign countries that can be called Russian-speaking. It's apparent that more than half of the population speaks Russian. Putin additionally claimed that Israel could be considered part of the Russian cultural world and said that songs which are considered to be national Israeli songs in Israel are in fact Russian national songs. He further stated that he regarded Russian-speaking Israeli citizens as his compatriots and as part of the Russian world. Putin condemned the October Hamas attack on Israel and said that Israel had a right to defend itself, but also criticized Israel's response and said Israel should not besiege the Gaza Strip in the way that Nazi Germany besieged Leningrad. Putin suggested that Russia could be a mediator in the conflict between Israel and Hamas, just as Israel offered last year to serve as a mediator in a potential peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. Both offers thus far have come to little more than just talk. Last month, the Israeli ambassador to the UN described Russian criticism at the UN of Israeli military action in Gaza as, quote, ridiculous, accusing Russia of attempting to divert attention from the Ukraine conflict. Relations between Israel and Russia continue to swiftly deteriorate. In a phone call earlier this month between Netanyahu and Putin, Bibi expressed displeasure over Russia's conduct at the UN, but thanked Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov for his involvement in freeing the Russian-Israeli dual national hostages held by Hamas. Shortly after the call, Russia demanded that Hamas immediately release all hostages, while Lavrov distanced Russia from Hamas, reiterating that Russia condemned the October attack and considered it terrorism, and maintained relations only with Hamas's political wing. There are political considerations for Putin as well. Hundreds of thousands of Russian-Israeli citizens currently live in Israel. During Russian elections, the Russian government sets up polling stations across Israel which enable the Russian citizens who are living in Israel to cast their votes. In the 2018 Russian presidential election, Vladimir Putin was the most popular candidate within Russian-Israeli voters, winning 73% of the vote in Israel. With Putin up for re-election in March of 2024, one wonders how he will fare this time around with Russian voters in Israel. Putin must also appease his own Jewish voters. Moscow has the largest Israeli expat community in the world. 80,000 Israeli citizens live in the city, almost all of them native Russian speakers. Many are dual citizens and live part of the year in Israel, but vote in Russian elections. Israel and Russia allow mutual visa-free travel between the two countries, and immigrants from Russia account for a significant proportion of Israel's citizenry. Hundreds of thousands of Russian tourists visit Israel every year, making Russia second only to the USA in Israeli tourism. Many Russians were in Israel when the October 7th attacks occurred, and some remain there as the war with Hamas rages on. They express disappointment at Russia's lack of solidarity with her own people in Israel. This will not be forgotten at election time next year, no doubt. I'm Lori Spencer. Thanks for listening.